Hi, my name is Tyler Knauer, and I did the Biogeography of the Marine Iguana. Just wanted to start out with some background on this lizard. It's the only seagoing marine lizard on Earth, and it's endemic to the Galapagos Islands, primarily living on exposed rocky headlands with lots of wave action or reef areas on those islands. Average adult male length, pretty large, about 1.3 meters. The males are larger than the females, so there is some sexual selection going on in the species, and weight varies from about 0.5 to 1.5 kilograms. These organisms primarily feed on about 10 different species of marine algae that grows in the intertidal zone. So they will be seen diving for up to about 30 minutes to feed on marine algae, especially the males, whereas the juveniles and the females that are smaller oftentimes will feed during low tide in the intertidal zone, foraging around. Historically, not a lot of natural predators on this island chain because there's just not really any mammals there. There is a Galapagos hawk, which can take hatchlings, but in general, they're not very scared of people or other predators, so can be an issue because they don't really have any innate fear of predators. So you can basically walk up to them if you're in the Galapagos, although obviously you're not allowed to touch them. They likely evolved from a land iguana that was introduced to the island. I'll talk about a little bit more about this later. And then finally, they do live in colonies, about 10 to 1,000 individuals depending on the island. And a lot of times they'll actually come together during the evenings at nighttime because it cools off substantially to keep their heat up inside their bodies. So they'll just all pile on top of each other, which is kind of cool. They do have a lot of special adaptations being a marine lizard. They're often not found in other types of iguanas across the globe. First of all, they have a very dark skin coloration, most of them, at least on some part of their body. And really what that is to do is to keep their body temperature up when they're basking in the sun. What they're going to do is they're going to heat up in the sun on the basalt rocks because it's volcanic rock along the coast of the Galapagos. They get their body temperature up around 96 degrees Fahrenheit, and then they will commence to dive in the water. The water in the Galapagos is generally very chilly, so their body temperature drops quickly, so they can't be in the water for too long, otherwise their metabolism slows down. If you ever see footage of them coming out of the water, they're kind of sluggish because their body temperature has been reduced significantly. They usually only dive 1 to 2 times per day to eat. They have a compressed lateral tail, so larger surface area, a little bit better for swimming, a little bit longer. So it's really adapted for swimming underwater. They have webbed toes to increase their swimming. If you look at their faces there, you can see they have really blunt noses and jaws, and that's to increase their ability to grab different types of algae off substrates underwater, kind of rip it off. Now, they are ingesting a significant amount of seawater to get water into their bodies, so they do have a salt gland on top of their noses, and if you look there, you can kind of see it's discolored, kind of white. That's because they continually sneeze out salt from their bodies to excrete excess salt. Lastly, another one that you'll see is they have kind of large claws, and that really helps them grip onto slippery intertidal substrates where there's a lot of wave action to get back up to their basking or sunny areas. Geographical distribution of these organisms, obviously they live in the Galapagos Islands. They're found on almost every major island in the Galapagos. Unfortunately, there hasn't really been an extensive survey done on these organisms just because it would be too expensive and they're too numerous and there's too many islands to actually perform a full-on survey. But there's somewhere between 200 and 300,000, maybe more, some scientists think, spread throughout the islands. Largest populations are on the largest island, which is not surprising because there's just more habitat. If you look up there, Isabella, Santa Cruz, Fernandina are kind of the ones that have the largest populations on them. They oftentimes are on the southern sides of the islands because they kind of prefer this heavy wave action areas and shallow reefs where there's a lot of marine algae growth. And they usually live about 2 to 5 meters above sea level where they're going to be sunning, and they have their eggs in more of a sandy or soft substrate. You can look over there on the right, most likely places to see those organisms on the islands if you do get a chance to go to the Galapagos. We're going to dig into the biogeography of these organisms. Let's talk about the evolutionary history and where these organisms came from in the first place. The common ancestor is probably a land iguana that ended up in the island about 10 million years ago. And that land iguana originates from Central and South America. So probably got there from rafting originally, may have been on some debris that floated off from the mainland onto the Galapagos. And then they've kind of moved or migrated between the islands since then. About 4.5 million years ago, based on the research, this marine iguana diverged from that land iguana in the archipelago. So it's relatively recent if you really think about it, but those islands aren't very old either, so not surprising. Between the subspecies on the island, they really vary in size, shape, and coloration, really depending on where they are and which island that they're on. So the most, or I guess you could say the original taxonomic classification of these iguanas really was from the mid-20th century, about the 50s and 60s. And that's when scientists defined 7 subspecies of the marine iguana. It was first identified in 1825 as one species, but in the mid-20th century, they really divided it into those 6 species that you can see there. And that's mostly divided up based off of their morphological features and where they live, what islands do they live on. So that's something we're going to talk about here, and that's come, a lot of the recent research is really centered around that. So you can see here, here's a bunch of the different subspecies. If you look at these pictures, you can see they can have kind of a red tinge, almost aqua in some cases, all the way to very, very black in color to absorb a lot of radiation, and kind of everywhere in between. But in general, they're going to have darker coloration as a whole to absorb more sunlight when they're on those rocks. They also have different crests and spines on their back. So that also is a way to tell kind of the subspecies apart. So if we dig into this taxonomic classification and kind of how it changed, it was about 60 years that this 7 subspecies system was sticking around, and there was a lot of problems with the systematics of this that scientists were finding in the 1990s and 2000s. So Morales 2017, this is one of the journal articles that I read, really updated this taxonomic classification by using population genetics, phylogenomic analysis, and comparative morphology. So basically, the cool thing about more recent research is what we can do is really take a closer look at the genome of these species to delineate different subpopulations from each other. And that's really using nuclear and mitochondrial DNA and microsatellite loci. So there's a lot of different things that we can do from a molecular standpoint to better understand these subpopulations. After this research and based off the evidence, these guys came up with 11 new subspecies. So they went from about a 7 to 11. And there's more research that is done that I really kind of dug into a little bit more that I thought was interesting when we start talking about speciation and hybridization. So a lot of conservation implications in terms of defining 11 new subspecies, because the ICUN threatened list really was only considering the 7 species from the 20th century. And now that we have 11, we may want to protect these marine iguana subspecies differently, because a lot of times we have more subspecies, we have smaller populations, so we're going to probably want to put in some more regulation in terms of protecting these small subpopulations. If you just take a look here on the left, we have that original taxonomic classification by Ebelsfeld, 1962. You can see there's 7 species over here. The new updated is going to be there for Morales, and you can see the 11 species. You can see most of them are really just divided up by island, which is no surprise when you look at island biogeography. They're going to adapt. They're going to have different genetic makeups based on geographical isolation. What we're going to take a look at now is San Cristobal Island, where there's 2 subspecies on the island, which was really surprising. So yeah, the second paper I really enjoyed and I thought was interesting from a biogeographical perspective was looking at the phylogenetic relationships on San Cristobal Island and looking at 2 different types of evolution happening there, speciation and parallel hybridization. So if you look here, you can see where we break away from the land iguana, and that's about 4.5 million years ago. And so here's your marine iguana. And if we break it down even more, we can see where these organisms break apart further between these 11 different species. What we're going to focus on in this paper are PP and LO, these two different subspecies that are found on the same island, San Cristobal. And you can see these other subspecies up here as well. So what they did, McLeod et al. In 2017, is they tried to rebuild that evolutionary history. And really what they came up with is really specific examples of speciation and between island hybridization. I'll talk about that in a second. San Cristobal is one island, so it's really unique that you have two different subspecies on that same island. It's really strange because they're so close geographically, and also these marine iguanas are highly mobile, so it wouldn't make a lot of sense that we'd have two subspecies on the same island. It makes a lot of sense with organisms like trees where they can't actually move, but it is very strange to have with marine iguanas, for example, or animals that can move freely between the different subpopulations. There wasn't a huge explanation in the paper. One of the things that they talked about potentially is this ongoing volcanism on the island, or lava flows that effectively were bottlenecking or kind of dividing up those different subpopulations, and so that they weren't intermixing as much. So that's kind of the case of the speciation that's happening on this island. You have two species evolving. It's called early incipient speciation, meaning that we're at the early stages of speciation with these two subpopulations because they're becoming so different from each other. Now, that being said, these organisms can still interbreed with one another and create fertile offspring. So they're still kind of considered the same species. Now, alternatively, what's going on, if you look over here, you can see we've got the LO subspecies and the PP up here. And you can see some of these lava flows in this area. But what was also happening with this hybridization was we were having migrants from Espanola. And what was happening was these marine iguanas were migrating into the population and into both of these populations and adding to the gene pool in both these populations, which is also really interesting. So on one level, we had speciation going in these two different parts of the island. But on the other, we had migrants coming in and hybridizing with these two different subpopulations, which is super interesting. So this probably maintained this primary marine iguana lineage. Is what was happening between all these islands is the marine iguanas were hybridizing with each other, and so really a lot of this divergence only happened super recently in about the last 250,000 years in terms of these subpopulations because they were hybridizing so much between each other. So it's a really cool, I guess it's a really interesting or fascinating example of two different things going on in evolution: small-scale speciation, as well as hybridization between islands, combining subpopulation gene pools. And so one of the overarching themes here is maybe one of the reasons that marine iguanas have been so successful in the long term is assimilating all these subspecies into their gene pools, thus increasing their genetic diversity as a whole in the gene pool to allow natural selection to work on those genes and increasing their evolutionary survival. So that's just one idea coming out of that. Finally, the last thing that we looked at here was what are the threats and what conservation strategies are we going to look at with the marine iguana? It is listed as a vulnerable species on the ICUN Red List. And some of the reasons of that are, one, obviously it's a really small range. It's just endemic to this small island chain out in the middle of the Pacific. The subpopulations can be very small, so that makes them vulnerable to impacts, especially anthropogenic impacts. The overall population size is very small and isolated, and there's a lot of potential negative anthropogenic impacts that could affect these organisms either currently or in the future. One of the most impactful things that can happen to island organisms is the introduction of non-native species. One of the leading causes of the loss of species on islands like Hawaii and other islands in the South Pacific, New Zealand, was the introduction of non-native mammalian species. The one that we're worrying about in particular on these islands are actually cats. Feral cats on the island, they're a huge problem on several of the islands. And they've been known to take marine iguana hatchlings Obviously, they're not going to take the adults because the adults are too big. But when these marine iguana hatchlings come out during these lekking events, these cats have been known to take them. I did read one paper researching what are the impacts of feral cats on marine iguanas. Unfortunately, they just didn't have a good enough data set to really get a great idea of how the behavior of feral cats changes during hatchling events. They did see that the cats were also taking hatchlings from sea turtle eggs as well. So really interesting, but definitely more research needs to go into taking a look at these cats and the impacts on hatchlings. They have done several eradication programs on multiple islands where they've actually either removed or killed the feral cats on the islands to help protect a whole slew of native species. The other thing that really impacts the wildlife on the Galapagos is the El Nino events. And El Nino basically is a warming of the Pacific Ocean, especially of the Eastern Pacific Ocean. What happens when the Eastern Pacific Ocean warms up is it stops the trade winds, and those trade winds are critical because they bring cold, nutrient-rich water to the surface of the Galapagos Islands near the coasts. And what happens when you cut off that cold, nutrient-rich water upwelling is the marine algae dies very quickly. Obviously, the marine algae is the primary food source of the marine iguana. So when you have very strong or severe El Ninos, you can have 80 to 90% mortality in the marine iguana populations and subpopulations due to the lack of food. Now, El Ninos, some evidence has shown that El Ninos are increasing because of anthropogenic warming of the earth. So is this a human impact? Maybe in some ways we're seeing stronger El Ninos, which could affect the Galapagos Islands. The second thing that's kind of impacted organisms on the Galapagos and marine iguanas are oil spills. There's been several. They have massive impacts on wildlife as a whole, but specifically on marine iguanas because the oil has been shown to kill the gut bacteria inside the marine iguanas that actually helps them to digest the all the different species of marine algae that they eat. So one study showed that in 2001 in Santa Fe Island there was an oil spill and that wiped out nearly 60% of a population of marine iguanas near that oil spill. And I believe that's a picture on the bottom right of that oil spill. Other than that, those are kind of the big impacts that I saw in the Galapagos Islands. Tourism is another one, but there's been a bunch of research done, and it shows that marine iguanas aren't specifically impacted by stress from tourism. So not a huge indicator there in terms of the impact of tourism on marine iguana behavior. Thanks a lot for listening. I learned a lot this semester about marine iguanas and really liked how the course was designed to give us the ability to kind of learn about individual organisms and kind of frame the whole biogeography class based on that organism. Hope you guys have a great rest of the summer. Here's my references, and see you soon.